He simply bought an old rusty refrigerator at an ordinary garage sale, expecting nothing unusual. But after opening it, he realized something was hidden inside that forced him to urgently contact the police. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The morning had the kind of stillness that made ordinary things feel deliberate. Sunlight lay flat across the identical roofs of the neighborhood, glinting off windshields and the thin metal edges of mailboxes. Lawns were already trimmed, hoses coiled neatly against garages, and the air carried a faint mixture of cut grass and gasoline. It was the kind of suburb where weekends moved slowly and predictably, where nothing truly unexpected was supposed to happen. Caleb Turner drove through it without hurry, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel of his aging pickup. The truck rattled softly at low speeds, a familiar sound he no longer noticed. The bed was half filled with the tools he kept there year-round. A dented metal toolbox, a coil of rope, a pair of work gloves hardened by years of use. He wasn't heading anywhere important. Saturdays like this were for wandering, for following cardboard signs with crooked arrows that read "Garage Sale" in uneven marker, for stopping only when something caught his eye. He had learned long ago not to rush these mornings. Rushing led to mistakes, to buying things he didn't need, or passing over the one item that might be worth something later. He made a living doing odd jobs, fixing what other people had given up on. Broken appliances, rusted frames, furniture with loose joints and bad reputations. He didn't romanticize it. It paid the bills, kept his hands busy, and gave him a quiet sense of control. Things were simpler when you could see what was broken and understand how to make it work again. The sign that drew him in was barely holding together, taped to a wooden utility pole at the corner of a side street. The arrow pointed toward a cul-de-sac. The handwriting faded as if the sign had been reused more than once. Caleb followed it, easing the truck around a bend lined with tall maple trees and neatly trimmed hedges, until he saw the open garage at the end of the circle and the small crowd gathered around folding tables. He parked a short distance away and stepped out, the heat of the sun already warming the back of his neck. The garage sale looked like all the others. Cardboard boxes filled with old clothes, mismatched dishes laid out on a tablecloth that had seen better days, a lamp with a cracked shade leaning against a cooler. A couple in their late 30s moved between the tables, smiling politely at passers-by, answering questions with the practiced ease of people eager to empty their garage before the day grew too long. Caleb drifted through slowly, nodding to no one in particular. He picked up a wrench, tested its weight, set it back down. He flipped through a stack of vinyl records without recognizing any of the names. Everything felt familiar, almost boring, and that was usually a good sign. It meant there was time to notice the things other people overlooked. It was only when he stepped towards the far edge of the driveway that he saw it. The refrigerator stood apart from the rest of the sale, pushed close to the fence as if it didn't quite belong. Its white enamel had yellowed unevenly with age, streaked with rust that bled downward from chipped corners and exposed seams. The handle was pitted and dull, and the surface of the door bore faint scratches that suggested it had been moved more than once, dragged rather than lifted. It was an old model, the kind that had been built to last decades longer than anyone expected, but something about it made Caleb slow his step. He circled it once, hands in his pockets. At first glance, it was just another dead appliance, too big and too awkward for most people to bother with. But as he drew closer, he noticed details that didn't quite add up. The door looked heavier than it should have been, sagging slightly on its hinges. Along the back edge, the metal had been welded in places where there shouldn't have been welds, the seams uneven and rough, as if the work had been done quickly and without concern for appearances. He reached out and pulled gently on the handle. The door opened with resistance, not the loose swing of an old refrigerator, but something tighter, more deliberate. Inside, the shelves were gone. The interior walls seemed thicker than normal, the space oddly shallow. Caleb frowned, tapping one knuckle lightly against the inner panel. The sound was dull, dense, not hollow the way it should have been. "Does it work?" he asked, glancing toward the couple near the tables. The man shrugged, offering a half smile. "Honestly, no idea. It was already here when we moved in, been sitting in the garage the whole time." The woman added, "We figured someone might want it for parts, or scrap." Caleb nodded, his attention drifting back to the refrigerator. "Previous owners leave it?" "Yeah," the man said. "The house was kind of a mess when we bought it. A lot of old stuff. We got rid of most of it, but this thing was heavy. Didn't seem worth the trouble." Caleb ran his fingers along the edge of the door, feeling the roughness of the metal. He noticed a faint outline where a manufacturer's plate might once have been riveted, now gone, the holes filled and painted over. That was strange. People didn't usually bother removing those. "How much?" he asked. The man laughed lightly. "Make an offer." Caleb thought for a moment, then named a price so low it was almost insulting. The man didn't hesitate. "Deal," he said, as if relieved the refrigerator would finally be someone else's problem. They shook hands, and the transaction was over as quickly as it had begun. Caleb fetched a dolly from the back of his truck and maneuvered it into place. As he tipped the refrigerator forward, its weight surprised him. He leaned back, bracing himself, muscles tightening as he guided it onto the dolly. The mass of it felt wrong, too heavy for something that was supposed to be mostly empty. As he rolled it toward the truck, one of the wheels on the dolly caught on a crack in the driveway. The refrigerator shifted abruptly, and from somewhere inside came a short, muffled thud. Not the rattle of loose metal or the clink of forgotten parts, but a solid sound, like something striking wood or packed fabric. Caleb froze for a fraction of a second. The man and woman both looked over. The woman's smile faltered just briefly before returning. "Careful," she said, "that thing's a beast." Caleb forced a grin and nodded, pushing the refrigerator the rest of the way without comment. He secured it in the truck bed with ropes, cinching them tight until the appliance barely shifted when he tested it. As he climbed back into the cab, he glanced in the side mirror. The couple stood at the end of the driveway, watching him leave longer than necessary. He told himself it was nothing. People watched buyers all the time, curious to see if the junk they'd been tripping over for years might finally be worth something to someone else. Still, the image stayed with him as he drove away, the neighborhood slipping past in neat rows of houses and trees. Back in his own driveway, Caleb unloaded the refrigerator alone, guiding it into the open garage with careful movements. The space smelled of oil and sawdust, familiar and reassuring. He shut off the engine and stood for a moment in the sudden quiet, listening to the ticking of the truck as it cooled. He rolled the refrigerator into the center of the garage and steadied it, wiping sweat from his forehead. Without really thinking about it, he placed one hand against the back panel and gave it a light push. Again, that dull, contained sound answered him from within. Caleb stepped back, studying the appliance under the harsh light of the bare bulb overhead. The rust, the welds, the missing label, the weight. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, they formed a pattern he didn't yet understand. He told himself he'd deal with it later. There was no reason to rush. He closed the garage door part way, leaving a strip of daylight along the bottom, and went inside to wash his hands. But even as he did, he felt a low, unfamiliar tension settle in his chest, a sense that the quiet routine of his morning had already shifted in ways he couldn't undo. When he returned to the garage and placed his palm once more against the refrigerator's side, he felt a faint vibration beneath the metal, subtle enough that he might have imagined it. He held his breath, listening. The refrigerator stood silent and inert, as lifeless as it appeared. Yet Caleb didn't move away. He stood there in the dim garage, the door half closed, the rusted appliance looming before him, and understood for the first time that he had brought something home that was never meant to be found. The refrigerator remained where Caleb had left it, standing in the middle of the garage like an accusation. The late morning light filtered through the narrow gap beneath the garage door, cutting a pale stripe across the concrete floor and stopping just short of its rusted base. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beam, settling on the chipped enamel and the faint scars where metal had once been worked and reworked by hands that were not his. Caleb tried to go about the rest of his morning as if nothing had changed. He made coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen counter, stared out the window at his small backyard without really seeing it. The refrigerator intruded on his thoughts in quiet, persistent ways. Every time his mind drifted, it returned to the dull thud he had heard, to the unnatural weight of the door, to the absence of a manufacturer's plate where one should have been riveted without question. By the time he stepped back into the garage, the air inside had warmed, carrying the familiar smells of oil, old wood, and metal filings. He pulled the garage door fully closed this time, the clatter echoing briefly before the space fell into a deeper, more private silence. He stood still, listening, half expecting to hear something move inside the refrigerator. There was nothing. Just the faint hum of the house settling and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. He circled the refrigerator slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Up close, the thing looked even stranger. The rust wasn't uniform. In some places it appeared natural, the slow decay of exposed steel over decades. In others it was too deliberate, almost painted on, as if someone had wanted the appliance to look older and more neglected than it truly was. The welds along the back panel were crude, uneven beads of metal that spoke of haste rather than craftsmanship. They had been ground down slightly, then painted over, but not well enough to disappear completely. Caleb crouched and examined the bottom edge. The feet were mismatched, one newer than the others, bolted on at an odd angle. He rocked the refrigerator gently from side to side. It barely shifted. The weight seemed concentrated in the body rather than the compressor area, which made no sense for a normal appliance. He pressed his ear against the side panel and knocked lightly with his knuckle. The sound that came back was thick and muted, as though the walls were packed solid. He straightened, exhaling through his nose. Maybe it had been modified for insulation. Maybe someone had reinforced it for cold storage. He had seen strange home projects before, things people built without knowing or caring how it should have been done. This could be another example, an overbuilt relic of a different time. He reached for the power cord, coiled loosely near the base. It was old but intact, the rubber stiff with age. The plug, however, was newer, a modern replacement that didn't match the rest of it. Someone had gone to the trouble of keeping it functional at some point. Caleb hesitated, then plugged it into the outlet on the wall. The refrigerator responded with nothing. No hum, no vibration, no click of a compressor trying and failing to start. It remained stubbornly silent. Caleb unplugged it again, and let the cord fall back against the floor. He opened the door and leaned inside, studying the interior more carefully. The walls were smooth, almost too smooth, and the corners were rounded in a way that reduced the usable space. The back wall bulged inward slightly, reducing the depth of the cavity. He ran his hand along it, pressing firmly. It didn't flex at all. When he knocked on it from the inside, the sound was the same dull thud he'd heard before. Caleb stepped back and closed the door. He felt a creeping unease he couldn't quite name. He had brought home plenty of odd things over the years, but this was different. There was an intentionality to it that bothered him. This wasn't a broken refrigerator someone had abandoned out of laziness. It had been altered, disguised, made to look worthless. He told himself again that he was overthinking it. Still, he pulled a flashlight from his toolbox and shone it along the seams of the back panel. The light caught on something thin and uneven where two sections of metal met. It looked like a secondary layer had been added over the original shell. He traced the seam with his finger, feeling the slight ridge beneath the paint. A knock sounded at the side door of the garage, sharp and sudden enough to make him flinch. He turned, heart jumping into his throat, and waited a moment before answering. "Caleb?" a voice called. "You in there?" It was Mrs. Donnelly from next door, her voice carrying easily through the thin door. Caleb let out a breath and crossed the garage to open it. She stood there with a grocery bag in one arm, her gray hair pulled back in its usual tight bun. "Sorry to bother you," she said. "I saw your garage door earlier and thought I'd bring you some of those muffins I made. Too many for me to eat alone." "Thanks," Caleb said, accepting the bag with a smile that felt slightly forced. "Appreciate it." Her gaze flicked past him toward the refrigerator looming behind. "That's an old one," she remarked. "They don't make them like that anymore." "Picked it up this morning," Caleb said. "Garage sale." She nodded, then frowned faintly. "Looks heavy." "Yeah," he said. "It is." "Well," she said, adjusting her grip on her purse, "don't work too hard. It's supposed to get hot later." He watched her walk back toward her house, then closed the door and locked it, the click of the deadbolt sounding louder than usual. The brief interruption had done nothing to ease his nerves. If anything, it had sharpened them. He returned to the refrigerator and placed both hands flat against the back panel. He leaned in and pushed, testing it. The appliance barely moved. He shifted his weight, pushing harder. Again, that muted sound answered him, deeper this time, as if something inside had shifted slightly and settled again. Caleb stepped away and wiped his hands on his jeans. He scanned the garage, suddenly aware of how exposed it felt. The windows were small and high, but someone could still see in if they wanted to. He considered covering them, then dismissed the idea. That would only feed his growing sense of paranoia. He decided to take the back panel off. If there was nothing there, he would know and could move on. If there was something, then he would deal with it when he saw it. He gathered his tools and set to work, unscrewing the visible bolts along the edges of the panel. Some came free easily, others resisted, stripped and stubborn. He cursed under his breath, applying more force. When the panel finally loosened, it didn't come away cleanly. It stuck, as if held in place by something more than screws. He pried at the edge with a flathead screwdriver, working slowly to avoid bending the metal. The panel came off with a grating sound, revealing a second surface beneath. It was smoother, newer looking, and completely sealed. There was no compressor, no coils, none of the components he expected to see. Just a solid wall. Caleb stared at it, his pulse quickening. This was no refrigerator he had ever seen. He ran the flashlight over the surface. There were faint outlines where something rectangular had been welded shut. The metal bore scratches, shallow grooves left by tools. Someone had cut into this layer before and then closed it again. The garage felt suddenly too quiet. Caleb became acutely aware of the sounds beyond its walls. A car passing on the street, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of an air conditioner starting up nearby. Ordinary noises, but they made his isolation feel more pronounced. He tapped the inner wall with the screwdriver. The sound that came back was dense and close, like striking a safe. Caleb straightened slowly, his mind racing. There was no reasonable explanation for this. Whatever was inside this refrigerator, it was not meant to be accessed casually. It was not meant to be found at all. He thought of the couple at the garage sale, the way the man had shrugged when asked if it worked, the way the woman's smile had flickered when the refrigerator shifted and made that sound. He thought of the missing label, the deliberate rust, the extra weight. He considered stopping. He could put the panel back on, roll the refrigerator into a corner, and forget about it. He could even take it to the scrapyard and let someone else deal with it. The thought brought a brief sense of relief. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. Caleb pulled it out and looked at the screen. An unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times, then silenced it. A moment later, a voicemail notification appeared. He didn't listen to it. Not yet. He stood there, the refrigerator looming behind him, the phone heavy in his hand. The ordinary logic of his life, the small rules he followed to stay out of trouble, felt suddenly inadequate. He had crossed a line simply by bringing this thing into his garage, by noticing what others had ignored. Caleb set the phone down on the workbench and picked up his flashlight again. He leaned closer to the sealed inner wall, tracing the faint outline of the welded rectangle with his fingers. Whatever was inside was packed tightly, deliberately, and hidden with care. Outside, a car slowed as it passed his house. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel, then the sound faded away. Caleb stepped back, his breath shallow, and glanced toward the garage door as if expecting it to open. It remained closed, solid, and unmoving. He was alone with the refrigerator and the growing certainty that he had stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than a simple garage sale find. He shut off the overhead light and left the garage in half darkness, the refrigerator's pale shape barely visible. As he went inside, he locked the door behind him, the finality of the sound echoing in his ears. He knew he wouldn't sleep easily that night. The refrigerator waited, silent and patient, holding its secret just beyond his reach. Caleb did not sleep. He lay on his back in the dark bedroom, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above him, its soft clicking marking time more faithfully than any clock. Every creak of the house sounded amplified. Every distant noise from the street filtered into his thoughts and reshaped itself into something intentional. A passing car became a slow patrol. The rustle of wind against the siding sounded like footsteps pausing just outside. At some point near dawn, he stopped pretending he might rest and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The house felt unfamiliar in the early light, as if it had shifted overnight. He made coffee he barely tasted and stood at the kitchen window until the sky brightened from gray to pale blue. When the sun finally rose, it brought no relief, only clarity. Whatever was hidden inside that refrigerator would not disappear simply because he ignored it. He went to the garage as soon as the neighborhood began to stir, before curiosity or fear could talk him out of it. The door lifted with a mechanical groan, and the smell of cold metal greeted him. The refrigerator stood exactly where he had left it, its back panel removed, the sealed inner wall exposed like a wound that refused to close. Caleb shut the garage door behind him and slid the lock into place. He moved deliberately now, not rushed but purposeful, as if the decision had already been made and his body was simply following instructions his mind had finally accepted. He pulled on thicker gloves, the heavy leather ones he used when working with sharp scrap, and laid out his tools on the workbench with care. Screwdrivers, a pry bar, a small hammer, a cordless drill, and finally the angle grinder, its disc nicked from previous jobs. He stood in front of the refrigerator for a long moment, hands on his hips, studying the welded rectangle again. In daylight, it was even clearer. The metal around the seam was slightly discolored, warped just enough to reveal that heat had been applied more than once. This was not a factory job. Someone had cut into this cavity, sealed it, reopened it, and sealed it again. That alone told him whatever was inside had mattered enough to revisit. Caleb started with the least destructive option. He ran the drill along the seam, testing for weak points, but the bit skidded uselessly across the hardened weld. He tried the pry bar next, slipping its edge into the narrowest gap he could find and leaning his weight against it. The metal resisted stubbornly, bending only a fraction before snapping back into place. He stepped away and wiped sweat from his brow. His heart was pounding harder now, not from the exertion but from the steady realization that he was no longer simply investigating an odd appliance. He was breaking into something that had been deliberately sealed, something that someone, at some point, had gone to considerable effort to hide. The angle grinder whined to life, its sudden noise harsh in the confined space. Sparks flew as the disc bit into the metal, showering the concrete floor with brief, angry light. Caleb worked slowly, tracing the outline of the rectangle, stopping often to let the metal cool and to listen. Each time he paused, the silence felt heavy, expectant. When the final cut was made, he shut off the grinder and stood back, breathing hard. The rectangle did not fall away on its own. He tapped it lightly with the hammer. It shifted just enough to confirm it was free. Caleb hooked his fingers into the edge and pulled. The panel came loose with a low, grinding sound, and a breath of air escaped from the cavity behind it. The smell that followed was faint but unmistakable, a mix of old oil, dry fabric, and something else, something musty and enclosed for far too long. It was the smell of time, trapped and compressed. Inside the cavity, packed so tightly it seemed impossible they had fit, were several rectangular bundles stacked with careful precision. They were wrapped in thick, yellowed cloth, each layer darkened with oil and sealed along the edges with hardened wax. The bundles were arranged like bricks, leaving no wasted space, no room for movement. Caleb stared at them, his mind momentarily blank. This was no casual hiding place. This was storage. Long-term, deliberate storage. He reached in and touched the nearest bundle. It was solid, heavier than it looked. He lifted it out of the cavity and set it gently on the workbench, as if sudden movement might damage it or trigger something unseen. The cloth crackled faintly under his fingers, stiff with age. He stood there for several seconds, simply looking at it. Part of him expected an alarm to sound, or the garage door to rattle, or his phone to ring again. None of that happened. The house remained quiet. Caleb picked up a utility knife and carefully sliced along the waxed seam. The blade met resistance at first, then slid through with a soft, tearing sound. He peeled back the cloth, layer by layer, until the contents were revealed. The sight made his breath catch. Inside was a tightly bound stack of paper, its edges perfectly aligned. It was wrapped again in thin oilskin, which he peeled away with trembling fingers. When the paper was finally exposed, he recognized it immediately, even before he saw the markings. Money. Not modern bills, not the colorful polymer notes he handled occasionally, but old paper currency, thick and cream-colored, with ornate designs and seals he had only ever seen in photographs. The ink was dark and crisp, the paper surprisingly firm. These were not random old bills stuffed into a drawer. They had been preserved. Caleb lifted the stack and felt its weight, real and undeniable. He flipped the top bill just enough to glimpse the serial number, then stopped himself. His hands were shaken now. He set the money down and leaned back against the workbench, trying to steady his breathing. This was no longer something he could explain away as a strange DIY project or an eccentric hoarder's stash. This was serious. This was criminal. He glanced toward the garage door again, half expecting to see the handle turning. Nothing moved. Caleb returned his attention to the cavity and carefully removed another bundle, then another, laying them out in a neat row on the bench. Each was identical in size and weight, each wrapped with the same obsessive care. There were more than he had expected, enough that the total amount of money, whatever it was, would be significant beyond anything he had ever handled. At the back of the cavity, behind the bundles, he noticed something different. A thinner package, wrapped in cloth, but without the same rigid structure. He reached for it and pulled it free. This one was lighter. When he opened it, he found folded papers, their edges brittle with age. There were several items: yellowed documents typed on thin stock, handwritten notes in careful script, and a small stack of black and white photographs held together with a rusted paper clip. Caleb picked up the photographs first. They showed people, places, moments frozen in time. A man standing beside an old car, his face partially obscured by shadow. A woman holding a child, her expression caught between a smile and something more guarded. A rural road stretching into the distance, marked on the back with a date written in pencil. The dates stopped him cold. They were old, not decades old, nearly a century. He set the photographs down and unfolded the documents. The typeface was formal, precise. He recognized some of the language immediately: references to deposits, transfers, certificates. This was not a diary or personal correspondence. It was financial, official, the kind of paperwork that left trails people tried very hard to erase. At the bottom of the stack was a folded sheet of heavier paper. Caleb opened it slowly, his heart pounding louder with every movement. It was a map. Not a printed one, but a hand-drawn map, detailed and meticulous. Lines traced roads and waterways. Symbols marked landmarks. Notes in the margins referenced distances and directions, some of them crossed out and rewritten. This was not an idle sketch. It was a working document, refined and corrected over time. Caleb spread it flat on the workbench and studied it. He recognized none of the places immediately, but the style was unmistakable. Whoever had drawn this had known exactly what they were doing. The map was meant to lead someone to a specific place, using clues only the intended reader would understand. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the garage. Money, documents, photographs, a map. This was a package of evidence, not a random collection of valuables. Someone had hidden not just wealth, but information. Caleb stepped back and looked at the refrigerator again, now gutted and silent. The appliance suddenly seemed less like an object and more like a message. It had been designed to disappear into the background, to sit unnoticed in garages and basements, passed from one owner to the next without question. It was the perfect hiding place because no one ever looked twice at an old refrigerator. His phone buzzed again. The sound made him jump. He grabbed it from his pocket and looked at the screen. The same unknown number. This time, a text message followed immediately after the missed call. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Caleb's mouth went dry. He read the message again, hoping he had misunderstood it. The words did not change. He did not reply. Instead, he turned off the phone and set it face down on the workbench, pushing it away from the bundles as if distance alone could protect him. His mind raced, trying to piece together how anyone could know what he was doing, how quickly curiosity had turned into exposure. He moved with sudden urgency, returning the money bundles to the cavity as carefully as he could. He did not reseal it, but he covered the opening with the removed panel and leaned it back into place to obscure the view. He gathered the documents and photographs, slid them into a cardboard box, and tucked it beneath the workbench, behind paint cans and scrap wood. Only the map he kept out, folding it once and slipping it into his jacket pocket, without fully understanding why. Something about it felt different. Dangerous, yes, but also essential. Caleb shut off the overhead light and stood in the dim garage, the refrigerator reduced once again to a shadowy shape. His hands were still trembling. The ordinary logic of his life had shattered completely, replaced by a stark, undeniable truth. Whatever he had uncovered was not finished with him. He locked the garage door and went back into the house, checking the windows, listening for unfamiliar sounds. When he finally sat down at the kitchen table, the sun was high enough to cast sharp shadows across the floor. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed. Caleb rested his forearms on the table and bowed his head, drawing a slow, deliberate breath. He understood now that the refrigerator was not the end of the mystery. It was the beginning. The money and documents were pieces of something unfinished, something that had waited patiently for decades until chance and curiosity had brought it back into the light. And whoever had sent that message was not content to let it stay buried. Caleb spent the rest of that day moving through his house as if it no longer fully belonged to him. Every familiar object seemed subtly altered by what he now knew was hidden only a few steps away in the garage. The refrigerator, once just an inconvenient hulk of rusted metal, had become something else entirely. It was no longer an appliance. It was a container for history, for crime, for decisions made by people who had believed they were clever enough to outlive the consequences. He did not turn his phone back on. Instead, he focused on the documents he had removed, the box tucked beneath the workbench now resting on the dining table in front of him. He waited until dusk, until the ordinary rhythms of the neighborhood softened. Porch lights came on one by one. Somewhere down the street, a television flickered behind drawn curtains. Only then did he carry the box inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. He laid the contents out slowly, one piece at a time, as if order itself might keep panic at bay. The photographs first. He studied them under the bright kitchen light, turning each over to read the faint pencil marks on the back. Dates, initials, short notations that meant nothing to him yet, but felt loaded with intent. The people in the photos stared back at him from another era, their expressions calm, unaware that their images would one day resurface in a stranger's kitchen. One photograph held his attention longer than the others. It showed a man standing near a roadside, a fedora pulled low over his brow, one hand resting on the roof of a dark sedan. The background was blurred, but Caleb could make out trees and what looked like a dirt road disappearing into the distance. On the back, written in careful script, were 2 letters and a date from the early 1930s. No name. Just a marker, as if whoever had written it needed only enough information to remember. The documents came next. Caleb handled them carefully, aware of how fragile the paper had become. He read slowly, piecing together meaning from language that felt both formal and deliberately vague. There were references to certificates, to values represented rather than held, to assurances backed by institutions that no longer existed. These were not casual records. They were instruments of trust, designed to move large sums of money quietly, efficiently, and with minimal scrutiny. He paused when he reached a page stamped with a seal he recognized, not from personal experience but from history books and old newsreels. Gold certificates. The term echoed in his mind, heavy with implication. These were bills backed by actual gold, issued in an era when money carried a different kind of weight, both literal and symbolic. He flipped the page and saw serial numbers printed in precise black ink. Caleb felt a tightening in his chest. Even without checking, he understood that these numbers mattered. They were identifiers, threads that could be traced back through archives and ledgers to moments of exchange that someone had wanted forgotten. He sat back in his chair and stared at the spread of papers, suddenly acutely aware of how dangerous knowledge could be. He had not just found money. He had found a story, one that had been deliberately interrupted. The map lay folded at the edge of the table, untouched until now. Caleb hesitated before opening it again, as if prolonging the moment might somehow soften what it would reveal. When he finally unfolded it, the paper crackled softly, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet kitchen. He spread it flat and leaned over it, tracing the lines with his eyes. The map was more complex than he had first realized. It wasn't a single route, but a network of paths, some emphasized, others crossed out and replaced. Landmarks were indicated not by names, but by symbols. A triangle near a bend in a river. A circle beside a road intersection. Short notes in the margins referenced distances measured in paces rather than miles. Caleb recognized none of the locations outright, but something about the layout felt deliberate, systematic. This was not a treasure map drawn for drama. It was functional. It assumed the reader already knew the terrain, that the symbols would trigger memory rather than discovery. He stood and fetched a magnifying glass from a drawer, an old tool he used occasionally for fine repair work. Under magnification, the map revealed even more detail. Tiny numbers, almost invisible to the naked eye, had been added near certain points. Corrections had been made, ink overwritten where someone had reconsidered a route or adjusted a distance. This map had been used, more than once. Caleb folded it again and set it aside, his thoughts racing. He needed context. He needed to know what he was dealing with before he made any decisions. Against his better judgment, he turned his phone back on. It buzzed immediately, lighting up with notifications. Missed calls, text messages, all from the same unknown number. His stomach tightened as he scrolled through them. The messages were brief, almost polite, but they carried an unmistakable edge. You bought something that wasn't meant to be sold. People are still looking for it. You don't want to make a mistake. Caleb locked the phone and set it face down on the table. His hands were cold now, his pulse unsteady. This was no longer abstract danger. Someone knew about the refrigerator. Someone knew it had been opened. He considered calling the police right then. The thought came with a rush of relief, followed immediately by doubt. He had tampered with evidence, broken into a hidden compartment, handled money that was almost certainly tied to a crime. How would that look? Would they believe he was just a curious buyer, or would he become the most convenient suspect in a case that had waited decades for someone to blame? He needed to know more. Caleb spent the next several hours cross-referencing what he could without leaving too many digital footprints. He searched broadly, avoiding specific serial numbers, focusing instead on historical events tied to gold certificates and large-scale ransom cases in the early 1930s. The results chilled him. One case kept resurfacing, mentioned in fragments across old articles and academic discussions. A high-profile kidnapping that had gripped the nation, involving an enormous ransom paid in gold-backed bills. The crime had been partially resolved, the main perpetrators caught and punished, but a portion of the money had never been recovered. Investigators had suspected an accomplice, someone who had skimmed a share and disappeared quietly. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his mind buzzing. He did not need confirmation to feel the weight of the connection. The timeline matched. The type of money matched. The deliberate hiding of documents and a map suggested preparation, paranoia, and a long-term plan to survive betrayal. The refrigerator made sense now in a way that was deeply unsettling. It was portable, unremarkable, a perfect disguise for something meant to be moved, hidden, and eventually retrieved. Whoever had built it had understood human behavior as well as mechanics. People ignored old appliances. They passed them on without question. Caleb's gaze drifted toward the window, where the reflection of his own face stared back at him. He looked older than he had that morning, his eyes shadowed by fatigue and something closer to fear. He realized then that his life had already begun to fracture along invisible lines. Even if he handed everything over to the authorities tomorrow, there would be no erasing what he had seen or the choices he had already made. A sound outside snapped him back to the present. Gravel crunching under tires. A car slowing near his house. He rose quietly and moved to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the blinds. A dark sedan idled at the curb, its engine running. The driver remained inside, face obscured by shadow. After a moment that stretched uncomfortably long, the car pulled away, disappearing down the street. Caleb exhaled shakily and stepped back from the window. His decision crystallized in that moment. He could not sit and wait, hoping this would resolve itself. Nor could he go blindly to the police without understanding the full scope of what he had found. He returned to the table and picked up the map again, holding it with renewed focus. Whatever this was, whatever danger it represented, the map was the key. It pointed somewhere specific, somewhere the people contacting him believed still mattered. Caleb folded the map carefully and slipped it into a manila envelope. He gathered the photographs and documents and returned them to the box, hiding it once more beneath the workbench in the garage. He paused there, listening, before replacing the inner panel over the cavity in the refrigerator. He did not reseal it. He only obscured it, buying himself time. When he finally went to bed that night, sleep came in short, uneasy stretches. His dreams were filled with images of rusted metal and paper marked with numbers that refused to stay still. By morning, his course was set. He would not run. He would not confront whoever was watching him directly. He would follow the map, and in doing so, He would step fully into the unfinished story that had been waiting, hidden in plain sight, for nearly a century. Caleb woke before dawn with the taste of metal in his mouth and the sensation that he had already been running for hours. For several seconds he lay still, listening to the house breathe around him, cataloging every sound until it settled into the ordinary. No footsteps, no doors, no engines idling outside, just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the quiet tick of cooling pipes, the distant bark of a dog announcing nothing in particular. It took effort to remind himself where he was and what he had decided. The map, the documents, the money hidden behind a wall of welded steel in his garage, and the messages that had stopped just short of a threat but carried one anyway. He got up slowly, careful not to turn on lights too early. The sky outside was still dark, the neighborhood reduced to silhouettes and dim porch bulbs. He brewed coffee and drank it sitting at the table, the manila envelope with the map resting in front of him like a sleeping animal. He did not open it yet. He already knew what it contained. What he needed now was confirmation, context, something solid enough to anchor his next move. By mid-morning, he had locked himself into a routine designed to look normal from the outside. He showered, dressed, stepped out briefly to collect the mail. A neighbor waved. He waved back. The performance felt hollow but necessary. Whoever was watching him, if anyone was, would notice a sudden change in behavior. Caleb did not intend to give them that satisfaction. When he finally sat down at his computer, he did so with care. He wiped his browser history first, powered the machine down, and restarted it, as if that might somehow reset the danger along with the software. He knew better, but rituals had a way of calming the mind. He began broadly, searching for public information, avoiding names and numbers. He read about the era, about the way money moved in the early 20th century, about crimes that had shaped policy and paranoia in equal measure. Again and again, he found himself circling back to the same infamous kidnapping, the same unresolved questions. Articles spoke of a ransom paid under intense pressure, of marked bills meant to trap the criminals, of a portion of the money that vanished as if swallowed by the earth. One article, buried deep in an archive, mentioned a hand-drawn map found among the belongings of a suspected accomplice who had died before he could be questioned. The map had been dismissed as meaningless, too vague to act on, its symbols indecipherable without context. It had been catalogued, photographed, and eventually forgotten. Caleb stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. He did not need to see the image to know. The description alone was enough: a hand-drawn map, symbols instead of names, corrections in ink. He closed the browser abruptly, as if the information itself were dangerous. His hands were shaking now, not with fear exactly, but with a growing sense of inevitability. This was not coincidence. The refrigerator, the documents, the map, the messages, they were threads of the same fabric, pulled tight across decades. His phone vibrated on the desk. Caleb did not touch it at first. He watched it buzz, the screen lighting up with another message from the same unknown number. When it stopped, he picked it up slowly and read, "You're taking too long." A second message followed almost immediately. "That never ends well." Caleb set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Whoever this was, they were growing impatient. That meant they believed something was still accessible, still recoverable. It also meant they did not yet have it. The thought brought him no comfort. He stood and paced the room, his footsteps measured. He considered calling a lawyer, then dismissed it. He considered driving straight to the nearest police station, envelope in hand, confession ready. The image flickered and faded. He was not prepared to surrender control completely. Not yet. He needed to understand the map, to know what it pointed to, and whether going there himself would help or destroy him. Caleb returned to the table and opened the envelope. He spread the map out carefully, smoothing the creases. In daylight, its details seemed sharper, more intentional. He traced the main route with his finger, following lines that suggested roads long since renamed or erased. He compared it to modern satellite images, rotating the map slightly, adjusting scale and orientation until patterns began to emerge. It took hours. By early afternoon, he had identified a general region, an area several hours' drive away, far from his neighborhood but not unreachable. The landmarks were subtle, the kind that would only make sense to someone familiar with the land. A bend in a river that had since been redirected. A crossroads that no longer existed, replaced by a highway interchange miles away. One marking stood out above the rest. A small triangle, drawn with heavier ink, positioned near what looked like an old rail line. Next to it, a note in cramped handwriting referenced a distance measured not in miles, but in minutes. Caleb leaned back, exhausted. This was not a place someone stumbled upon. It was a destination reached by intent. He glanced at his phone again. No new messages. That worried him more than the threats. Silence suggested calculation. Late that afternoon, he drove to the hardware store under the pretense of needing supplies. He bought nothing he didn't already own. Nothing that would look suspicious. On the way back, he took a longer route, watching his mirrors carefully. Twice, he thought he saw the same dark sedan at a distance, but each time it disappeared before he could be sure. At home, he packed a small bag. Not as if he were leaving for good, but enough for a day trip. Water, gloves, a flashlight. A folding shovel he kept for gardening. He did not pack a weapon. The thought crossed his mind, lingered, then passed. If things came to that, he doubted it would matter. As evening approached, he stood in the garage one last time, looking at the refrigerator. He touched the metal briefly, feeling the cold seep into his palm. It was strange to think that something so ordinary had become the axis around which his life now turned. He did not take the documents or the money with him. That felt like a line he was not yet ready to cross. Instead, he photographed the map carefully, from multiple angles, then returned the original to the envelope and hid it again. If he did not come back, at least a record would exist. Just before sunset, his phone buzzed again. "Don't go alone," the message read. Caleb stared at it for a long time, his mind racing. It was not a command. It was advice, or a warning, or perhaps a test. He did not reply. He left the house as darkness settled, locking the door behind him with deliberate care. As he drove away, the streetlights flickered on one by one, illuminating a neighborhood that would sleep peacefully, unaware of the history and danger slipping quietly past it. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, and Caleb understood, with a clarity that bordered on dread, that whatever waited at the end of the map's path would not be content to remain buried. The road out of town felt longer than it should have, as though distance itself had decided to stretch. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, posture rigid, eyes moving constantly between the dark ribbon of asphalt ahead and the rearview mirror. The sky was heavy with low clouds, swallowing the last traces of daylight and pressing the world into a narrower, more uncertain shape. Every mile marker passed like a quiet countdown. He had chosen not to leave in the middle of the night. Something about that felt too much like running. Instead, he had waited until the hour when traffic thinned but had not vanished entirely, when his departure could still be explained away as ordinary. Even so, the act of leaving carried weight. Each turn took him farther from the small, controlled space of his life and deeper into a story that no longer belonged to the past. Caleb kept the radio low, the murmur of voices and music serving as a fragile tether to normalcy. He did not listen to the words. His mind was occupied with the map, its lines and symbols replaying behind his eyes. He had memorized as much of it as he could, the triangle near the old rail line, the distances measured in minutes, the subtle corrections that suggested trial and error. Whoever had drawn it had not trusted memory alone. They had expected to come back. The first hour passed without incident. Then the road narrowed, the houses thinning out until they were replaced by long stretches of dark fields and clusters of trees that leaned inward like silent observers. Caleb checked his mirrors again and saw headlights far behind him. At first, they seemed harmless, another car moving at a similar pace, but when he changed lanes and the headlights followed, a thin line of unease tightened in his chest. He told himself not to overreact. People shared roads. Coincidences happened. Still, when he took an exit he did not strictly need to take and the car followed, the unease sharpened into something colder. Caleb's pulse quickened. He adjusted his speed slightly, then more deliberately. The car behind matched him, maintaining distance without closing the gap. The headlights never wavered. They were patient. He considered pulling over, forcing a confrontation in a public place, but the exit had led him onto a quieter road, flanked by dark trees and occasional reflectors that flashed briefly in his peripheral vision. There were no gas stations, no diners glowing invitingly in the dark, just the road, the trees, and the steady presence behind him. After several tense minutes, he slowed and signaled, turning onto a narrow side road that branched off like an afterthought. Gravel crunched beneath his tires. For a moment, the headlights behind him disappeared, and he felt a surge of relief so strong it left him lightheaded. Then, the headlights reappeared, swinging onto the same road. Caleb exhaled slowly, forcing his grip on the wheel to remain steady. Panic would not help him now. He drove on, the road winding through a sparse forest, the canopy overhead blocking what little light the moon might have offered. The map had led him this way for a reason. He only hoped that reason did not end with him alone on a dark road. Ahead, the trees thinned and the road opened into a wide gravel clearing. An old sign stood at the edge, its lettering faded beyond recognition. Beyond it, barely visible, ran the raised embankment of an abandoned rail line, the tracks long since removed, but the shape of the route still clear against the land. Caleb slowed and pulled into the clearing, cutting his headlights and coasting to a stop. For a moment, there was only darkness and the ticking of his engine as it cooled. He waited, listening. The other car did not follow him into the clearing. Instead, it slowed on the road, headlights sweeping briefly across the open space, then continued on, disappearing into the trees beyond. The sudden absence felt almost as unsettling as the pursuit. Caleb waited another full minute before moving. When he finally stepped out of the truck, the air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of earth and decaying leaves. He grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing, revealing nothing but scattered stones and the ghostly outline of the rail embankment rising beyond. He climbed the embankment slowly, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. At the top, he paused and turned off the flashlight, letting his eyes adjust. The landscape was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if sound itself had been dampened. No insects, no distant traffic, just the faint rustle of wind through leaves. Caleb took out his phone and brought up the photograph of the map. He oriented himself, counting paces the way the notes indicated, moving carefully, aware of how easily a misstep could erase the trail entirely. The minutes marked on the map were not literal time, he realized, but distance measured by walking, by human movement through uneven ground. He reached the spot just as the map suggested. At first, it looked like nothing at all. A shallow depression in the ground, half hidden by undergrowth, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Caleb crouched and brushed away leaves and dirt with his gloved hands. His fingers struck something solid. He cleared more debris, revealing the edge of a concrete slab, weathered and cracked. It was small, no larger than a manhole cover, and partially sunken into the earth. A metal ring protruded from one side, rusted but intact. Caleb sat back on his heels, heart pounding. This was it, or part of it. He hesitated, scanning the surrounding area once more before grasping the ring and pulling. The slab resisted at first, then shifted with a groan of protesting metal and stone. Caleb leaned his weight into it until the slab tipped and fell aside with a dull thud. Beneath it was darkness. He aimed the flashlight downward, the beam cutting through the black to reveal a narrow concrete shaft descending several feet into the ground. At the bottom, something metallic glinted faintly. Caleb swallowed and climbed down carefully, bracing himself against the sides. The air grew cooler as he descended, heavy with the scent of damp concrete and old rust. When his boots touched the bottom, he shone the light around and felt a shock of recognition. There was a container there, not large, but unmistakable. A heavy metal box, its surface scarred and dented, a padlock hanging open and useless from one corner. It had been forced at some point, the metal bent inward. Caleb approached slowly and knelt, shining the light inside. The box was empty. He stared into it for a long moment, his mind struggling to reconcile the absence with everything that had led him here. The map, the refrigerator, the messages, the pursuit. This place should have held something. It should have been the answer. Instead, it was proof. Someone had been here before him. Someone had followed the map, or their own version of it, and taken whatever had once been stored here. The emptiness was not failure. It was confirmation that the map was real, that the refrigerator's contents were a part of a larger system. Caleb climbed back out of the shaft and stood in the clearing, the flashlight beam shaking slightly in his hand. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a new message. "You're standing in the right place." A second message followed. "You should have stayed home." Before Caleb could respond, headlights flared at the edge of the clearing. A car rolled in slowly, deliberately, its engine idling low. Caleb turned, his heart hammering, and took a step back. The car stopped several yards away. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, remaining in shadow. Caleb did not run. He stood his ground, the cold night air filling his lungs, the weight of everything he had uncovered pressing down on him. He understood now that this was no longer about curiosity or even survival. It was about control, about who held the last pieces of a story that refused to stay buried. The figure spoke, voice calm and unhurried, carrying easily across the clearing. "You weren't supposed to come alone." Caleb tightened his grip on the flashlight, its beam flickering between them. The unfinished business of the past had finally caught up, and there would be no retreat from what came next. The man did not step closer right away. He remained near the car, one hand resting casually on the open door, his posture relaxed in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. The headlights stayed on, backlighting him so that his face remained unreadable, reduced to a silhouette edged in pale glare. The clearing seemed to shrink around them, the trees forming a dark wall that pressed inward. Caleb's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Run, and he would be visible, slow on uneven ground. Fight, and he would be outmatched before he even understood the rules. Speak, and risk saying the wrong thing. He chose the only option that bought time. "I didn't know I needed company," Caleb said, his voice steadier than he felt. The man chuckled softly. "People never do. That's usually how they end up in trouble." He took a few steps forward, just enough for the light to catch a part of his face. He was older than Caleb had expected, late 50s perhaps, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of habitually controlled expressions. He wore ordinary clothes, jeans, and a jacket that could have belonged to anyone. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, and that was what made him dangerous. "You've been busy," the man continued, "opening things that stayed closed for a long time." Caleb felt a surge of anger beneath his fear. "If you know that much," he said, "then you know I didn't steal anything. I bought a refrigerator at a garage sale. Everything else followed." The man nodded slowly, as if conceding a point in a private debate. "That's true," he said. "You didn't steal it. That doesn't mean it was ever meant to be yours." The implication hung between them, heavy and deliberate. Caleb glanced past the man toward the car, half expecting to see another figure step out. No one did. "What do you want?" Caleb asked. "For you to stop," the man replied without hesitation. "You've seen enough. You've proven the map was real. That should satisfy your curiosity." "And the messages?" Caleb said. "The following me? That's just concern for my well-being?" The man's smile faded slightly. "That's insurance," he said. "Same reason the refrigerator existed in the first place." Caleb's grip tightened on the flashlight. "You're connected to this?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," the man said, "in a way that doesn't benefit from official attention." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night pressed in, the silence punctuated only by the distant creak of trees shifting in the wind. Caleb realized then that the man was not here to negotiate. He was here to assess, to decide how much of a problem Caleb truly was. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. The man studied him carefully. "That depends on what you do next." Before Caleb could respond, the distant sound of an engine cut through the quiet. Not one, but several. Headlights flickered through the trees on the far side of the clearing, moving fast, purposeful. The man's expression changed instantly. The relaxed calm vanished, replaced by something sharper, more alert. He turned his head slightly, listening, then swore under his breath. "That's unfortunate," he said. The vehicles burst into the clearing moments later, red and blue lights flashing violently against the darkness. Tires skidded on gravel. Doors slammed. Voices shouted commands that echoed off the trees. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" Caleb froze, shock washing over him. He had not called them. He had not had time. Yet here they were, sudden and overwhelming. The man near the car reacted faster than Caleb could process. He stepped back, hands raised just enough to look compliant, his face already shifting into a mask of confusion and mild irritation. "Easy," he said calmly. "What's this about?" Officers moved in with practiced precision, weapons drawn, lights blinding. One grabbed Caleb's arm, pulling him away from the shaft and toward a patrol car. Another forced the man to the ground, cuffing him swiftly. Caleb's heart hammered as he was guided to the side, his flashlight taken from his hand and dropped onto the gravel. An officer shone a light in his face. "Sir, are you injured?" the officer asked. "No," Caleb said. "I'm not." "Did this man threaten you?" Caleb hesitated, glancing toward where the man was being searched. Their eyes met briefly, and Caleb saw something flicker there. Not fear, calculation. "He followed me," Caleb said carefully. "He's been sending messages. He knew about this place." The officer nodded, already signaling to another to secure the area. More lights illuminated the clearing now, revealing details Caleb had missed before. Fresh tire tracks, footprints near the shaft that did not belong to him. Within minutes, the scene transformed into controlled chaos. Evidence markers appeared. Officers spoke into radios, their voices clipped and efficient. Someone photographed the open shaft and the empty container below. A senior officer approached Caleb, her expression serious but measured. "You're going to need to come with us," she said. "We have questions, a lot of them." Caleb did not argue. He felt drained, the adrenaline ebbing fast. As he was led to the patrol car, he caught a final glimpse of the man being placed into another vehicle. He did not look back. The drive to the station passed in a blur of lights and fragmented thoughts. Caleb replayed the night in his head, the map, the pursuit, the confrontation. He wondered who had tipped the police off and why now. Had the man miscalculated? Had someone else been watching both of them? At the station, the questions began almost immediately. They took him to a small interview room, bare except for a table and 2 chairs. An officer brought him water, then left him alone for several minutes that felt much longer. When the door finally opened, 2 investigators entered, one older, one younger, both carrying folders thick with paper. They introduced themselves and got straight to it. "Tell us about the refrigerator," the older investigator said. Caleb took a breath and began at the beginning. The garage sale, the weight, the welded panel, the money and documents. He spoke slowly, carefully, leaving nothing out. He described the messages, the map, the decision to follow it. The investigators listened without interruption, occasionally exchanging glances or jotting notes. When he finished, the younger investigator slid a photograph across the table. It showed a stack of old bills laid out under fluorescent light, evidence tags attached. "Do these look familiar?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "Yes." "Gold certificates," the older investigator said. "Serial numbers match a ransom list from a 1932 kidnapping case." The words settled heavily in the room. "We've been looking for those bills for decades," he continued. "They were marked, recorded. Most of the ransom was recovered, not all of it." Caleb swallowed. "The map?" he asked. The younger investigator leaned forward. "That map fills a gap we've never been able to close. We believe it leads to the original drop site, or one of them, the place where a part of the money was diverted." "And the man?" Caleb asked. The older investigator's expression hardened. "He's connected, not directly to the original crime, but to its aftermath. Family, inheritance, people who spent their lives protecting something they didn't earn." Caleb leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. "So, what happens to me?" "You're a witness," the investigator said. "A crucial one. You did the right thing coming out here, even if you didn't realize it." Caleb thought of the messages, the pursuit, the man's calm confidence. "He didn't think you'd show up," he said. "No," the investigator agreed. "And neither did we. Someone else tipped us off. An anonymous call, Gave us your name, your vehicle, and the location." Caleb frowned. "Who?" The investigator shook his head. "We don't know, yet." The implication lingered. The story was not finished. Someone else still held pieces of it. They kept Caleb at the station until morning, taking a formal statement, photograph in his hands, cataloging his belongings. He was treated with professional courtesy, but the gravity of the situation never eased. When they finally released him, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the parking lot. An officer walked him to his truck. "You should be careful," she said quietly. "People don't like losing things they've protected for a long time." Caleb nodded, too tired to respond. As he drove home, the world felt altered, sharper around the edges. The empty roads, the early morning light, the ordinary rhythm of life resuming all felt unreal. He knew that his involvement had not ended with one night in the woods. It had only changed shape. When he pulled into his driveway, he noticed immediately that something was wrong. The garage door stood slightly open. His stomach clenched as he parked and approached cautiously. Inside, the refrigerator was still there, but the space around it had been disturbed. Boxes shifted, tools moved. The cardboard panel he had used to obscure the cavity lay on the floor. They had been here. Caleb stood in the quiet garage, the weight of that realization settling over him. The police had one piece of the story now. He had another. And somewhere, unseen, someone else still held a stake in how it would end. He closed the garage door slowly, deliberately, knowing that the past had reached into his life and would not let go easily. The garage felt different now, emptied of its illusion of privacy. Caleb stood just inside the door for a long time without moving, his eyes adjusting to the familiar space that no longer felt familiar at all. The refrigerator loomed against the far wall, silent and inert, yet it carried more weight than ever. It was no longer simply the object that had started everything. It was evidence, history, and a reminder that chance had a way of selecting its witnesses without warning. He did not touch anything at first. The police had already been here once, but whatever intrusion had happened while he was gone had not been official. That much was obvious. Tools were out of place in subtle ways. Nothing overturned or smashed, just shifted enough to tell him that someone careful had moved through the space. Someone who knew what they were looking for and what they were willing to leave behind. Caleb closed the garage door and leaned his back against it, exhaling slowly. The events of the night replayed in fragments. The clearing, the empty metal box, the calm voice in the dark, the sudden arrival of flashing lights. It felt less like a memory and more like a sequence of images borrowed from someone else's life. Inside the house, his phone buzzed again. He flinched, then steadied himself and went inside, closing the door behind him. The screen lit up with a number he now recognized, not from contacts but from repetition. This time there was no message, just a missed call. He stared at it, then powered the phone off completely and set it on the counter. The silence that followed was thick, almost physical. Later that morning, a black sedan pulled up in front of his house. Caleb watched from the window, his body tensing automatically, until he recognized the woman who stepped out. The senior investigator from the night before moved with the same controlled confidence, a folder tucked under her arm. He opened the door before she knocked. "We need to talk," she said, her gaze flicking briefly past him into the house. "May I come in?" Caleb stepped aside and let her enter. She did not waste time with pleasantries. They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where he had first spread out the documents, though now the surface was bare. "We finished a preliminary analysis," she said, opening the folder. The refrigerator was modified sometime in the late 1930s. The welds, the materials, the techniques all point to that period. It wasn't built for one job. It was built to last. Caleb nodded slowly. So it really was a portable vault. In a sense, she replied, the person who built it understood something important. That if you hide something too carefully, people notice. But if you hide it in plain sight, wrapped in something mundane, it can move through decades untouched. She slid a photograph across the table. It showed the refrigerator's interior, the cavity exposed, the bundles neatly stacked. The money you found, she continued, was a portion of the ransom skimmed before the official drop. The map you discovered wasn't the only one, but it was the most complete. It corrected earlier mistakes. Whoever kept it was meticulous and deeply afraid. Afraid of being betrayed, Caleb said. Exactly, she replied. The accomplice knew that if the main perpetrators were caught, he would be next. So he split the risk. Some money went to the drop. Some went into the refrigerator. The map was insurance, proof, leverage. Caleb stared at the table. And the man in the clearing? She hesitated. His grandfather was the accomplice. The words landed heavily. He inherited the secret, she went on. Not the money itself, but the knowledge that something was still out there. The refrigerator passed through several hands over the years, estates, storage units. Eventually, it ended up in that garage. When it was sold, he panicked. That's when he started watching you. And the anonymous tip? Caleb asked. She met his eyes. We believe it came from someone else in the family. A fracture. Disagreements about what to do with the secret. Fear that he would make a mistake. Caleb leaned back, absorbing it all. So it was only a matter of time. Yes, she said quietly. You just happened to be the one who opened the door. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of generations pressing into the small kitchen. What happens now? Caleb asked. The remaining evidence has been secured, she said. The map, the documents, the money. The empty container at the site confirms the timeline we suspected but could never prove. The case will be formally closed. And him? He'll be charged, she said. Not for the original crime, but for obstruction, threats, and interference with a federal investigation. It won't bring anyone back, but it will end the inheritance of fear. She stood and gathered her folder. You'll be mentioned in the report, she added. Your cooperation was crucial. Caleb walked her to the door. When she left, the house felt quieter than before, as if something essential had been removed along with the danger. News of the discovery broke 2 days later. Caleb saw it first online, then on television. Headlines spoke of a cold case finally resolved, of ransom money hidden for nearly a century, of a chance purchase at a garage sale that changed everything. His name appeared briefly, then vanished, replaced by broader language about a private citizen. Neighbors began to look at him differently. Some asked questions he didn't answer. Others avoided him entirely. Reporters came once, then again, then stopped when it became clear he had nothing more to say. The refrigerator was removed by authorities the following week. Watching it be loaded onto a flatbed, Caleb felt a strange mix of relief and loss. It had been a threat, a burden, but also the catalyst for something larger than his own life. When the truck drove away, the garage felt oddly empty. Time passed. Slowly, the tension eased. The messages stopped. The sense of being watched faded into memory. Caleb returned to his routines, though they no longer felt as solid as before. He still visited garage sales, still fixed broken things, but with a new awareness of how easily the ordinary could conceal the extraordinary. One evening, months later, he stood in the garage, staring at the faint rust stain left on the concrete where the refrigerator had stood. It would fade eventually, scrubbed away by use and time, but for now it remained, a quiet marker. Caleb understood then that the story had never truly been about the money. It was about fear passed down like an heirloom, about secrets kept too long, about the fragile illusion that the past could be controlled if it was hidden well enough. He turned off the light and closed the garage door, the sound echoing softly in the stillness. Inside the house, life went on, ordinary and unremarkable, exactly as it should. Somewhere, in archives and evidence rooms, the truth now rested in folders and files, finally at peace. And Caleb, an accidental witness, carried forward the knowledge that the most dangerous things were often the ones everyone learned to ignore. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. New stories are coming, and some of them go even deeper than this one. Watch the next video on the channel to see how ordinary discoveries turn into shocking truths. And if this story surprised you, share it with someone who loves mysteries like this. You never know what they might uncover next.